Hey everyone, Mirai here, and welcome to another Hardware Talk video. In this one, we are going to be talking about the Magewell HDMI 4K Plus capture card. I think I got that right. It's a complicated name. Oh boy, this has been quite interesting as well. It's good. In the end, TLDW, too long didn't watch. In the end, it's good. You can turn the video off now, 2 thumbs up. Everything's fine, but I had to jump through a lot of hoops to get to the everything's fine point. So I got some notes here as usual, and I'll be trying to move through these as fast as I can. It might be a little technical in some of this stuff if you're just not familiar with recording software and everything. I don't understand all of it myself, so you're not alone if you don't understand all of it. And I'll try to be playing something in the background, but there's really not much to play here. There's not a lot of demonstrations to show off. I do plan on doing a completely separate video at some point in the hopefully nearish future where I show the difference between software and hardware recording, kind of like a recording software showdown or something like that. Of course, whenever that is done, that will be linked in the description, of course, but it's going to be some time before that is done. But without further ado, let's get into this hardware capture card. So what does the capture card solve, right? Because there's how many people are there out on the internet doing the gameplay thing and uploading it to YouTube or uploading it somewhere else, and everything is seemingly fine, right? Well, I can really only talk about this from somewhat of a 1440 standpoint, but mostly a 4K standpoint. So software does definitely fall short in a lot of areas. Now, it solves 3 things in particular for me. Just simply the offloading of hardware resources to another machine, not having to deal with variable frame rate. We will talk about that. And then a VSync issue that happens in exclusive full screen mode. At least that was what I was experiencing with software. So obviously it's very, very simple and straightforward that the offloading of resources to another machine is nothing short of fantastic. Playing at 4K, even whether solo or multiboxing, just simply hitting record on your recording software chews through a lot of CPU or even sometimes a good bit of GPU depending on what's happening. And that's just a bonus. It's not the main reason I needed a capture card. Obviously, I do have I've had pretty beefy systems the past few years, so I have been able to handle recording with software, but it's a big bonus being able to offload that, not having to worry about any, frame rate issues or anything like that with software that pushes the CPU usage or the GPU usage too high that you don't really want to be in that area, right? So now we'll talk about variable frame rates, and this is where things maybe get a little convoluted. I'll try to move through this quickly and give as many details as I can. So variable frame rates are just really unneeded in my opinion. They cause nothing but issues. And again, a lot of people will not have issues necessarily. If you are someone who merges all of your audio and all of your video right into the same file as it's being captured, it's probably not an issue. Probably not. But it still could be. However, someone like me who has a special setup, I don't even want to call it fancy. If I could merge all this stuff together more easily, that would be fantastic. But I do have an external camera that I record from. I do have a microphone that records into its own audio file onto the second machine that I've got. And then, of course, if I'm doing desktop capture, that's done on the main machine. So then I have to put all this together, and it needs to sync together. It needs to work. So a variable frame rate is something that is only seen in software. If you go ahead and you ask on a forum like the Adobe forum, you ask, what is it? My footage is out of sync. Can you guys make Adobe work with variable frame rates and whatnot? Or an adaptive frame rate is what it's also called. And you have all these videographers and these cinematographers that come out of the woodwork, and they come to the thread and they're like, what is a variable frame rate? What is that? Because it doesn't exist anywhere except software. In the real world where people do real hardware camera work, that doesn't exist. Whatever you set to be your target frame rate is what you're going to get. If I set my camera to record in 59.9 or 60 frames per second or 24 or 29.9 or 30 frames per second, you're going to get that footage you're going to get that frame rate when you look at the footage. That's what it's going to be. But a variable frame rate is a frame rate that changes throughout the video file. So bringing this back to software, if you record with a constant frame rate, if your software even allows for that, so you're recording at 60 frames per second, but let's say you can't maintain 60 frames per second, you dip down into the low 50s or the high 40s or something, what's going to happen is the software is going to continue to record at 60 frames per second. But just like what you just saw on screen, you saw a little bit of a stutter because your frame rate dropped. The recording software is going to record that. So when you watch it back, there's going to be a little bit of a stutter. That's kind of expected. It just seems normal. If you can't maintain 60 frames per second, yet you are recording in 60 frames per second, you will have a small little stutter there. No big deal. The problem arises there with a constant frame rate if for some reason you've set 60 and you can't even maintain 60. Like you can only maintain like the high 40s or something. Well, then that footage is going to look like ass, and you should probably switch it up to record at 30 frames per second instead, right? That's something that makes sense to me. Now, on the other hand, variable frame rate, you will set 60 frames per second as your target. But as you dip down in frames from time to time, the software will go ahead and adjust the frame rate at which it records at. So when you drop down to 52 frames per second, it will change the actual video footage to be recording then in 52 frames per second. If you drop into 48, it's going to record at 48. If you shoot up to 58, it's going to record then in 58. And all of this is going to change the way that the video file plays back. Now, when you watch it back, it's going to play back just fine. It's going to play back smooth when you watch it back. But when you go to edit the footage and you try to sync that variable frame rate up with something that is a constant frame rate, like a camera, or even this audio that syncs up with the camera then, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work whatsoever. So programs that have variable frame rates, Shadowplay has a... Now, you know what? Maybe I should preface this by saying I haven't used software in probably 10 months. So it's been a long time, and they could have added constant frame rates. They could have changed the options up a little bit. I don't know at this time. I'm sure I'll figure all that out whenever I make that next video. But whenever I had to do all this for the past several years, Shadowplay has a variable frame rate that can't be used. You can't switch it to constant frame rate. Bandicam has a variable frame rate, which can be switched to constant frame rate, but it has a little subtext below the constant frame rate option that says if you can't maintain your target frame rate, we'll just go ahead and switch it up to variable for you. Thanks, Bandicam. Thanks a lot. So while it's constant frame rate in Bandicam, it's not really, because if you can't maintain that, well, you don't get to keep it. They're just going to switch it up to variable for you, just unannounced. Marillus Action records within a variable/adaptive frame rate. That wasn't always the case. I began using Marillus Action a long time ago, prior to the 1.22 update. That's when they added variable frame rate, and that's when all the issues began to happen. I'm not sure. I have no idea why developers decide that, you know what, we're just going to switch this up and not give our users a fucking option. What if someone wants to record in constant frame rate? Let them. Let them record in constant frame rate. What is the problem there? So, for instance, OBS records in a constant frame rate and has an option for you to check a little box that says use a variable frame rate. So you have the option with OBS on the other hand there. So that's nice. Someone might throw out and say, hey, what about DX3? Well, DX3, as far as I know, doesn't record the actual desktop, right? All of my videos record the desktop. You can see all of the game clients. You can see me, bring up web pages and minimize the web browser, bring up ISBoxer, minimize ISBoxer. You can see all that happening because I'm capturing the desktop. If you hook onto a game client specifically, then you're only going to see that game client. It doesn't matter what you are trying to show people. So in all my tutorials and all my gameplay, I need to capture the desktop. That is what I need. And as far as I know, I even purchased DX3 to test it. As far as I know, DX3 does not capture the desktop. If there's an option to do that, it sure is fucking buried somewhere. Or it was at the time last year when I was trying to use it. Someone else might also throw out, hey, what about Fraps? Fraps is totally fucking broken. Things hasn't been updated in 4+ years, almost 5 years going on now. I think it's been like February 2013 is the last update it saw. If you still play at 1080, you can probably still use Fraps, no problem. It probably works just fine. Of course, you do have to deal with the giant frame file sizes that it does produce. 1440, it might also still work well at 1440 as well, but the file sizes are going to be even larger. On the other hand, 4K, I've tried to load Fraps in the past at a 4K resolution. Simply loading the program up affects the game right then and there. And I get shit performance inside of the game client itself without even pressing the record button. Once I press the record button with Fraps, the frame rate is just, single digits, lucky if it's double digits. There's something wrong with the software. It obviously needs a major update to support. Maybe it's a Windows 10 issue. I don't know. But regardless, Fraps is pretty useless to me. Even if it did work at 4K, it does record at a constant frame rate. It certainly does. It does not even have a variable frame rate option, which I used to use Fraps. Fraps is great. But the file sizes that it would actually produce at 4K would be so ginormous that it would be completely unusable for me. I don't want to use all that disk space. I may have a lot of disk space now, but I don't want to eat it all up with hundreds upon hundreds of gigabytes worth of Fraps footage at 4K. It's just not what I want to be doing. So all of that's kind of the major softwares that are used. I don't know. AMD obviously has their side of things. So Shadowplay is NVIDIA Share is NVIDIA's stuff. So AMD does have their stuff. I have no idea. I don't have an AMD GPU to test any of this on. So I don't know. AMD may have an awesome constant frame rate that works great, but so the problem is then syncing everything up, and it just ended up being a nightmare. Everything you see, even for the past several years, because I've only had this capture card for about 10 months now. So for the past several years, all of that gameplay footage that Supernova and I used to do, we will still do it, but just from the past year and a half, 2 years or whatever, all of that is done with variable frame rate. And behind the scenes, you can watch that footage back, and it's all nice and synced up. You know, the lips match my audio and everything, all the in-game sounds match what's happening on screen. That's great. That's great. But I had to sync all of that up myself. I couldn't just throw all the footage into Premiere Pro and say, hey, just line it up here, line it up there at the end, and we're good. Good. Just render it out. No. The variable frame rate screws everything up. So that was a major thing to try to get around. Now, obviously, I did say that OBS does use a constant frame rate, and OBS did work. It did work when the game clients, when I was multiboxing in a windowed mode, right? That's what we multibox. We multibox in a windowed mode. So OBS did work at that point, and OBS was good. So if you're looking for good software, OBS in windowed mode probably works great. Although OBS did have a weird problem for some time where it ate up additional GPU for like no apparent reason. But that's, again, haven't used it in a long time, so things could have changed, clearly. What we get to a problem now is we move on to the next issue, which is the VSync in exclusive full screen with SLI. So if you didn't watch the last video, or if you don't just know my setup, I am an SLI user at 4K. I like to crank my settings up. In a lot of games, that requires, still even today, multiple GPUs. A single 1080 Ti doesn't necessarily get you every setting maxed out at 4K. Sometimes you need to use SLI. So I like SLI for those times where I'm playing solo and whatnot. I also like VSync. I don't like to just uncap my frame rate. I don't get a very smooth result in that, especially at 4K. When you play at 4K, you don't get, like if you're playing at 1080 and you uncap your frame rate, you usually get a ton of frames, right? You can usually get like 200 plus frames in a lot of games just, with a really powerful GPU. Unfortunately, I don't normally get much over 100 frames per second. In some places where there's less detail, I will get more frames per second, but I normally don't get over much of like 90 to 110 or somewhere in there. And that's kind of an issue that still creates some stuttering on my screen. I don't like stuttering. I don't like choppiness. I don't like jerkiness. I don't like that stuff. I turn on VSync and it is buttery smooth and it's amazing. It's great. I love it. I don't care if there's added input lag with VSync. I don't care. I get around it for the most part by using pre-rendering frames of 1 in the driver settings, but that's beyond the scope of this. But of course, you can eliminate input lag altogether by uncapping your frame rate and not using VSync, but I don't like that. That's me. That's my personal preference, so we need to work around that. Now, the problem with the software at this point is that Shadowplay, when I was using it, had a problem with this and would just, instead of recording nice and smooth like I was seeing on screen, there would be a stutter every so often. It was very apparent, and it was odd that it would just happen every few seconds. It was just something to do with the buffer, something to do with SLI. I'm not entirely sure. Not entirely sure there. Bandicam, I've never had good results with Bandicam. I haven't. So it fell short across the board, and I'm sure I'll delve much more into that whenever I do the other video. Marilla's Action was really good. For what it could achieve, it was really good. But again, playing in exclusive full screen mode, I found that it fell behind the curve at points in time you would look back at the footage and the footage was completely mangled. It wasn't even like it was just slightly out of sync. I mean, just absolutely, there was times where it would just speed up really fast and it would leave the audio way behind. So the audio would play at a normal rate, but what you were seeing on screen gameplay-wise was completely sped up. And then in order to even itself out, it would then crash down in terms of playback speed, and it would just be really slow motion, but the audio was playing the same rate across all, completely unusable. And that would happen every once in a while, but it would not be apparent that was happening to me when I was recording. When I'm playing the game and I'm recording and everything's great and we're playing with friends and, doing PvP or something, there was absolutely no impact on screen that would indicate that there was an issue or there was a stutter that was happening or this speed up and slow down was something that was being embedded into the video file at that point in time. So it was a mystery as to why it was happening or when it was happening and how it was happening. It's not something I can decode on my end, right? It's not something I can decode. And that's something that was able to be repeated. This is something that was happening to me for years, right? For years. Just on and off. No clear-cut reason for why it was a problem. But then OBS was great in the windowed mode when capturing the desktop. But when it comes to multi-display adapter capture, they'll tell you in the OBS forums that you're going to get shit performance. So the way to work around that is you capture the desktop. And I tried to capture the desktop then when playing an exclusive full screen mode. It's a little odd because what is the desktop at that point, right? The desktop is the active screen, really. So it should just capture the exclusive full screen game. And it did, about 50% of the time. And when it did, it captured it perfectly. I was like, this is amazing. My first few tests I did with it was great. It was perfect. It was like this was the answer. OBS had everything. It had the windowed mode capture, the exclusive full screen mode capture, VSync, SLI, 2 thumbs up. And then I started doing some longer gameplay tests with it. And times I would open up a piece of footage that was an hour long, and it's completely black. There's no video that was recorded. It's all just audio. I was losing my mind, man. Nothing could cover all of the bases that I needed. Nothing could do it in terms of software. Now, I had tried to find a hardware capture card prior to just last October, because the card I have now is only a year old. It only came out just last October in 2016. Before that, and it's still around today, there's a Blackmagic DeckLink 12G, which is like $1,400. And that's way more expensive than what I paid for this thing, even though this was expensive. That's way more expensive. It's definitely suited for the studio. It has SDI inputs and everything like that. It does have a daughter board that attaches to it that has HDMI inputs. So there is that. That does capture 4K 60 frames per second. I don't know anything about it. The reviews were kind of iffy about it, although you have to wonder if those people were actually using it in a studio or what they were doing with it, right? So you never really know. But $1,400 was way out of my, I was still trying to struggle with software at that point. So what do you do? Well, I was lucky enough that, like I said, just last October, Magewell released this card that could capture 4K 60 hertz. Before this, they did have a card that did 4K 30 frames per second or 30 hertz. And I thought about buying that. I was like, I don't really, the whole reason I wanted to do this YouTube thing at 4K, I adopted 4K early. I wanted to do 4K 60 frames per second. I didn't want to drop it to 4K 30 frames per second. This camera does 59.9 or essentially 60 frames per second. So I would have half the hardware to do 60, but the other half would be doing 30. And it would just, I don't really like 30 as a frame rate. It just seems a little blurry and slower. The faster frame rate you can capture, the more hertz, the smoother things look, right? So luckily enough, it did come out. And so I picked it up. In December of last year, I picked it up. I didn't really get around to finishing this secondary machine until probably the end of December or early January. And then finally, I was trying to get other things together, just both of my systems working and everything together and getting situated. So then I didn't really get around to using the card or attempting to really use the card until early February, somewhere in there. And that's when I began to learn about all of the issues that I was about to run into. So the first issue is that when I finally hooked the card up, I should explain this. The way that capture cards work is you have multiple outputs on your GPU. So you plug one of the cables coming out of your GPU needs to go to your main display so that you can see what you're doing, right? Then you plug in a second cable to your GPU, and that cable then goes to the capture card, the capture device, no matter where it is. Sometimes they're external devices. This one happens to be an internal PCI Express card, right? So you capture, you have two outputs on your GPU, and they both go one to the display, one to the capture card. Great. And then when you look at Windows on your main computer, you look at Windows, you look at the display settings in Windows, and you can see that there's two displays there, even though you only have one. It's the capture card that's mimicking a display. It's saying, hey, Windows, I'm a display. Send me a signal. That's all that it's doing. So it takes a signal and it acts like a display. And in this case, you would just mirror your displays. You should just mirror whatever's on the primary display to the secondary display, and the capture card would then take that signal. And that worked. And I was like, oh, this is great. But then I'm seeing a bunch of signal loss. And what I'm seeing then is whenever it records is I'm seeing a test pattern pop up and it says no signal. And I'm seeing that a lot. If I wasn't doing a lot with the card, if I was just kind of like sitting on the ground, staring at zoomed into the ground, and there weren't any real details going on in the scene, I wouldn't get any signal loss. All of a sudden, if I, just testing in World of Warcraft or something, flying around a major city, all of a sudden when there's a bunch of detail in the scene, I would get just endless signal loss, completely unusable footage. I mean, it was just unreal. And at this point, I'm thinking, okay, well, it's got to be HDMI cable maybe, So I'm doing research and I realized that there are HDMI cables that are not capable of actually carrying a 4K signal, even though they will plug into the ports. So there's some history there. HDMI 1.4 was the old standard. 2.0 is the new standard. And of course, there will be future standards. I think we're looking at 3.0 in the near future here. But 1.4 cables are the exact same as 2.0 cables. They're the same port. They use the same cables and everything inside. The problem is that 1.4 cables only needed to carry about 10 gigabits per second across their wires. Whereas 4K 60 hertz requires almost the full bandwidth of the cable, which is theoretically 18 gigabits per second. So it's almost twice as much. And those cheapo cables, they just can't carry the signal and you get endless signal loss. So I thought that was my problem. So HDMI actually just has recently begun releasing cables, or there's actually been a certification, HDMI premium cable. So I'm looking for premium cables only. They're a little bit more expensive, but I'm trying to get as many premium cables as I can to see what's wrong with the signal loss. Why am I getting all this signal loss? So I'm plugging in all these different cables. Nothing's changing. Nothing's changing at all. So here I'm thinking, okay, got this expensive card. We're outside of the return window for Amazon, so I can't just send it back. If the card is screwed up, then I'm going to have to send this back with a warranty, within its year warranty to service it. I'm like, well, that's nice. I didn't even get to use this card. I've had this thing for almost 3 months now. And well, this kind of sucks, doesn't it? So I have no idea. Even to this point, I can't remember what really motivated me to try this. But what I did was I pulled both the cables out of the top GPU. So this was my old setup. I had 3 GPUs. I had a 3-way SLI Titan X setup. So I pulled the cables out of the top GPU and I plug them into the bottom GPU. And everything works perfect. No signal loss. I'm dumbfounded. I take the cables and I put them into the middle GPU. No signal loss at all. I plug everything back into the top GPU. Endless signal loss. So what was different? What was different about that top card? And unfortunately, I don't know, because it's not like when I'm locked in with water cooling, it's not like I could have just swapped the positions of the GPUs to see if the GPU was bad. But I dealt with that for well over a week, just trying to figure out, ordering a cable or two at a time from Amazon, getting the cables in, realizing it's not fixing the problem, ordering different cables, getting those in, realizing it's not fixing the problem. It's this slow trickle process that was driving me insane. And when I finally changed the GPU, which I was, whatever I was using, it worked. And it's totally dumbfounded. Even today, I'm still speechless whenever it comes to telling the story, because I have no idea what fix. I don't know why that is. I have no idea. But the problem then is that if you don't have your GPU, your main display plugged into the primary GPU, the topmost GPU, the one closest to the CPU, whenever you boot up, you're not going to see the BIOS window. That's been true for every motherboard I've ever used. I think that's true for pretty much every motherboard, is that really only the primary GPU gets the power until Windows boots up, and then everything starts up. So if I don't use the topmost GPU, I can't see the BIOS, and I don't see any screen. I don't see any picture on my screen until Windows boots up. So that was kind of a problem. You're not really in and out of the BIOS a lot, but there were times when I had to change things and I'd constantly be flipping the cables around. That was kind of an annoyance. So once I was able to fix the signal loss, here we are. Now I can finally run some tests. So I'm recording footage, and I'm trying to, the deal with the capture card, like I just said, it mimics a display. So you still need to use software to tie into the card, to detect the card, and be able to read its signal. So OBS can do that. FFmpeg can do that. There are some software made specifically to grab into a capture card and record. So I'm still having to record on the secondary machine with software. But I had said that OBS does constant frame rate recording. FFmpeg also does constant frame rate recording. It is what I use today. I like FFmpeg a lot. It's very versatile. It's very confusing at the same time, but you could do anything with this fucking software, man. In terms of just flexibility and recording, and just you have all the options available to you. But anyway, so here we are. We're recording, and I'm capturing, and I'm not seeing the same quality for what I'm seeing on my main display. And the problem is, and I should have this video actually, the problem was, I'll throw something up here and you'll see that on the left-hand side, I think it is a camera capturing my display, an external camera capturing my display. I'm trying to move a Blizzard, I think I'm moving the Blizzard launcher around on a white canvas from MS Paint. And you can see that on the left-hand side, or whichever side is the display captured with a camera, it's very smooth. It's perfect. And that's what I would see on my side. But then the other side of the video here is what the capture card was recording. And it's stuttery, it's jerky, it's not smooth. It's not smooth by any means. And that's what was happening. And so here we are, we're at stage 2. How do you fix it? What is this? What is this and how do you fix it? What is this? So here I am once again thinking, what's the problem? What could possibly be the problem? I am at the front of the line. I'm in the frontier here. There's no one else here with me. Who else is multiboxing, capturing exclusive full screen, all at 4K? Who's doing this? Who's doing it? You got to remember, the card's been out for about 3, maybe 4 months at this point. How many people do you think bought up this expensive ass capture card and they're doing the same shit I am? Nobody. Nobody's doing that. I am the only person. So what do you plug into Google to find out results that you're probably not going to find? Luckily, I eventually stumbled upon the problem. The problem is actually a limitation in Windows, the operating system. All 7, 8, 8.1, 10, and even still at this point. The limitation is that when you use a VSync signal, it is only sent to the primary display, and it is not given to any other display that you mirror your main display to. It is not given to any of those. So I'm only mirroring to one other. You could technically mirror to another 10 displays if you wanted to, but only the display that is set as primary in Windows, that is set as your main display in the operating system, is going to receive the VSync signal. So obviously my main display, the one that I can see things on, is the main display as per Windows. And it's the one that's receiving the VSync signal. The capture card is not receiving the VSync signal, so it's almost as if the frame rate is just capped at 60. And that's the stuttering that it's seeing. So what now? What do I do now? Well, I do have the option to change the capture card to the primary display, and then it will receive the VSync signal, and everything I do on my main display then will be very choppy, and there will be nothing but tearing, when you don't have, if you can't reach the frame rate that you have set on your display in-game, then there's a bunch of tearing because of the mismatch. So that's what the capture card was getting as well. It was getting a lot of tearing as well. So the next step was then to just continue to scour the internet in hopes that I could figure something out. And I don't remember where I came up with this either. I had to have stumbled upon this somewhere. But the next step was to try to use an HDMI splitter. That was just a shot in the dark. Is this going to work? So HDMI splitters, the cost of those range anywhere between $40 to $50, all the way up to like $400. What do I start with? Do I start with the cheapest model? Do I start with the most expensive model? Is this even going to work? Is the VSync signal going to properly be duplicated across the displays? So I bought the cheapest one. It seemed like it would work. And there weren't really that many options. You got to remember 4K 60 hertz over HDMI 2.0. We're pushing the absolute limit of this cable, right? This will all become cheaper. There will become many more options available in the future, but we're talking 10 months ago. There's not a lot of choices. But I get this cheap splitter in, and I hook it up, and lo and behold, the VSync signal is indeed duplicated across the capture card and the display. However, the way that these little boxes work, they're just little hardware boxes. There's no software configuration involved in any of these as far as I know. What they do is they read the EDID information, the EDID information off of whatever it's hooked up to. So what the EDID is that there's something stored in your display that whatever's hooked up to it gets this signal sent back to it, or whatever's hooked up to it reads it, and it tells that device then what's the native resolution, what's the maximum, what resolutions can this display use. So that's contained in the EDID. So this little box reads the EDID of everything that's hooked up to it, so which is the capture card and the main 4K display, and it reads it, and it's supposed to make a best guess as to what's the most compatible resolution. So whatever it was displaying on my main display and whatever was being recorded was wrong. It was not 4K. I looked in Windows. I saw the resolution that was set. It said 3840 by 2160. So it's not a problem with the setting in Windows, but what I'm seeing is not 4K. I couldn't even describe it. Well, I guess the best I can describe it is that there were a bunch of little black bars and the text was all messed up and nothing was clear. There was a lot of garbled information on screen. So I thought that maybe inside of the display panel itself, like, you go into the options, you bring up the on-screen options, you go into the panel, you can change like aspect ratio and some other settings sometimes. I thought maybe if I changed some of that, maybe it would change what it read on the EDID and it would make a better guess at what was a compatible resolution. So I was not able to fix that, but what I noticed that when I was in the display's settings itself, it shows me right on the main screen before I go to any sub option, it shows which port I'm using and what resolution I'm running at. And it was telling me that it's running at 1920 by 2160. If you're familiar with the 4K resolution, that's 3840 by 2160, at least UHD for 16 by 9 gaming and computers and whatnot. 3840 by 2160. Well, half of 3840 is 1920. What I was seeing was that every other column of pixels was being rendered, and in between there was just a black bar. So it was a column of pixels, black bar, column of pixels, black bar, and it looked like ass. And that's why it thought it was 1920, because it was missing an entire column of pixels every other column. So this is obviously not going to work. I've wasted my money on this. I need to send this back to Amazon. Now, Amazon, if you don't know, is not really a rental service. They don't really like it when you buy a bunch of shit and then you're constantly sending things back to them. Unless, of course, you've got a bunch of defective stuff, right? This, I said it was defective, but it's probably working just fine. It was just broken somehow. It wasn't detecting things right. So what do I do now? I got the proper VSync signal split, but do I go with another splitter? Do I try another hardware splitter? I don't really have an option at this point, so I did. I tried a more expensive splitter, and sure enough, I got a Geffen UHD 600, and it works. And it works. And then that's where we are today, and it works. I'm so happy that it works. I was all the hoops, all the orders I had to place. It was just such a relief that finally I got something in and it worked. And expensive ass capture card, expensive HDMI splitter, but here we are today. I've got very, very sexy setup in terms of capturing and recording, offloading all the resources to the other machine. No problems whatsoever in that department. So everything is great in that department. And there's two more things we need to talk about just real fast. First of all, the HDMI port on this card is very finicky. It's very finicky. It's installed into the Thermaltake Tower 900. The motherboard is rotated 90 degrees, and that means all the cards that are mounted in there are then mounted vertically instead. So the top of the case, there's a roof to the case. You plug the HDMI cable into the top of this card, and then the top of the case comes down, but it touches it touches the cable. The premium cables, they're a bit stiffer because they have more shielding. They have a larger gauge wire in there. They're just a bit stiffer, so they don't bend as easily. So where it's plugged in, there's a good bit of arc before it goes flat and then goes out the back of the tower itself. So when you put the top on this thing, it does touch that cable. And it could potentially move the cable and wiggle it a little bit to where it puts it in a position to where I get signal loss. I didn't realize this at first. For the first few months, it wasn't an issue until just recently, within the last several months. I was messing around with the case enough and go to record things for what I thought was going to be, a final video. And I go back and I watch the footage and there's a bunch of signal loss in there. I'm like, what the fuck is going on? Is this thing broken? What's happening? Are we back to this again where I have to now solve issues? But it was just the port issue. If you wiggle the cable a little bit in the wrong direction, you get signal loss. It's not the cable, it's definitely the port. So there's a problem with that. I'm not about to send it back though. I don't care. It's fine. What I did was I just jammed a little piece of water tubing between the cable itself and the chassis, and it pushes it, it holds it, in the position where it doesn't get any signal loss. So that's fine. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with jerry-rigging stuff every once in a while. The other option, the final issue, it's not really an issue, but when it comes to options for recording with software, I have to use the GPU. I can't even use the CPU because I said you have to use FFmpeg or OBS or something like that. And OBS was able to peg my 8-core, 16-thread 5960X when recording in 4K X264 with the ultra-fast preset. It was able to peg that CPU. Therefore, this secondary machine only has a 6-core, 12-thread 4930K in it. It definitely gets, it's definitely useless when it comes to trying to record with X264 in a 4K resolution. So I can't use the CPU. I have to use the GPU. Thankfully, I do have an NVIDIA GPU, at least a fairly newer one, Maxwell Generation 980 Ti. So I do have access to a lot of the NVENC NVIDIA encoding options, and that's what I use. There are still some weird limitations that I'm just not sure how to read. There's no documentation on any of this stuff. Like there's a buffer, but I don't know where that buffer is. I don't know if that buffer is software controlled, capture card controlled, or GPU controlled. I have no idea. I'm going to guess that it's the capture card, but I really don't know. You can define a buffer. You can define the size of the buffer all the way up to something like 2.2 gigabytes worth of buffer. So right now I use a 1.5 gigabyte buffer. It seems to be fine. If I try to capture in lossless, which I can't, no matter what my buffer is, if I try to capture in lossless, it tells me I'm using over 100% of the buffer and therefore I'm getting dropped frames. Okay, well, we'll just increase the buffer. We'll just give it all the way up to 2.2 gigabytes. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't fix anything at all. It still tells me I'm using over 100% of the buffer, no matter what buffer size I give it. It's confusing. It's not really good feedback and what the problem is, so I'm not really too sure. Both OBS and FFmpeg show this, so obviously there's a buffer somewhere in one of these three things that is being overrun if I've tried to put too much quality into this. But I still am able to record 4K at 400, upwards of 400 megabits per second, which is absolutely glorious. That's perfect. That's really, really nice. That's usually my limit. If I try to go any higher than that, that's when I start to get more buffer overflow problems. But normally when recording with something like Shadowplay, which I used for a while, Shadowplay only does a maximum of 130 megabits per second, which I thought was cutting it a little close when it came to 4K footage. World of Warcraft, not such a big deal. World of Warcraft is not a super detailed game, but if we're talking something like Terra Online, Blade and Soul, maybe even something like Final Fantasy XIV, where there's a lot of detail all throughout the game world and in character armor and costumes and whatnot, all of that, 130 megabits per second at 4K is cutting it just a little close in my opinion. And I was seeing some artifacting in those other high detail games. So now that I can record upwards of 200, 300, 400 megabits per second, it's no longer an issue. And that's really nice. Color space difference is a little odd. I have to find a match. Right now I can only use NV12 as the input. I can't seem to use anything else for some reason, other than trying to use lossless, which again I just said didn't work all that well. Too much of a buffer problem. So, but that's it, man. That's it. That's the journey. My voice is completely shot at this point. It's been a long video, but that's been the journey up to this point. The capture card has been a giant headache. At least it was 10 months ago, but for the last 10 months, it's been beautiful. It's been great for the last 9 or 10 months. And I will continue to use this capture card moving forward. And I do recommend a capture card to anyone really looking to just offload the resources. And again, you don't need anything too ultra crazy, right? You don't need to spend as much money as it is for this capture card. If you're playing at 1080, you can get a cheaper 1080 capture card. If you're playing at something like 1440, you can get, say, the Magewell 4K version with the 30 hertz version of the 4K card from Magewell, and then you can change it in the configuration to record 1440 at 60 hertz, I believe. So you can look at something like that. That's obviously a much cheaper option than what I've got here today. But if you're looking at 4K, looking to make the move to 4K, just be warned that there is a lot of hardware resources required to record at 4K. Or if you're okay with dealing with the variable frame rate, because Shadowplay works great at 4K outside of the variable frame rate, which I had to get around. So I think that's it. It's been a long video. Again, if you are new here, my name is Mirai. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.